Bonsoir, bonne soirée. On behalf of the Center for International Policy Studies, CIPS, and the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue at the University of Ottawa, a warm welcome to the Ottawa premiere of Astra Taylor's film, What is Democracy? And to a conversation in response to her timely question. You may access the live closed captions for me and other participants with the closed caption feature on the bottom right of your Zoom screen. Please select Show Subtitle. Alors me voici, ayant monté les marches avec Tom McSorley, directeur de l'Institut du film canadien, au merveilleux salon Alma Dunklin, chez nos voisins à la Galerie d'Art d'Ottawa. In addition to the Ottawa Art Gallery, we've partnered with the Canadian Film Institute, the National Film Board, and the students of the iVote, jeVote project, led by our friends at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Avant de commencer, je voudrais saluer nos amis à Mashkawasi-Wagamig, le Centre de ressources autochtones à l'Université d'Ottawa, pour leur soutien et l'affirmation qui suit. Car nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date, l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Et nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Veuillez noter que vous pouvez visionner une version française du film si vous le souhaitez. Le lien vous est disponible sur le site web du CEPI ou à travers votre inscription. And please note that the film version we are screening is subtitled as well. Its quality at home via the internet may be a little sketchy, but the content, I promise, is sumptuous. And we invite you to join the discussion about the film on social media with the hashtag #WhatIsDemocracy, all one word, ou en français, qu'est-ce que la démocratie, tout un mot. So now, without further ado, I give you Astra Taylor's What is Democracy? See you at 7:30 p.m. when Tom McSorley and Astra Taylor will launch our discussion about it. Bonne projection.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Tom McSorley, the Executive Director of the Canadian Film Institute. Founded in 1935, the CFI is Canada's oldest nonprofit, non-governmental cultural organization and registered charity dedicated to the moving image. Bonsoir et bienvenue encore. Je suis Tom McSorley, directeur général de l'Institut canadien du film, et c'est mon grand plaisir d'ouvrir la deuxième partie de notre soirée, la conversation autour du film, en présentant la metteur en scène Astra Taylor. Before we do that, we have a couple of housekeeping items to do, so indulge me a little bit here. First, to follow this panel discussion with closed captions, please click on the closed caption on the bottom right of your screen and then select Show Subtitle from the menu. En français, sélectionnez Montrer sous-titres. And to follow the discussion and to propagate the discussion on social media, let's get it as far and wide as we can. We invite you to use the hashtag #WhatIsDemocracy, all one word, ou en français, qu'est-ce que c'est la démocratie? I'd also like to open with the Indigenous affirmation shared by the University of Ottawa's Indigenous Resource Centre. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. And now it's truly a pleasure to welcome Astra Taylor to the virtual Ottawa, I guess. She was born in Winnipeg, and among her many contributions to our understanding of social justice are 3 films: jeVote from 2005, Examined Life in 2008, and tonight's film, of course, from 2018, What is Democracy? On our theme, she's also published a book last year with a brilliant title, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. And her most recent work, of which we see many threads of it explored in the film, focuses on student debt. Can't Pay, Won't Pay, The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition, and that was published this year by Haymarket Books. So please welcome to our forum, Astra Taylor. Astra, welcome.
Yes, thank you so much for doing this. It's really lovely to have the film screened and to see you both and to have this amazing esteemed panel. I had no idea exactly what I was getting into when I started to pursue the theme of democracy. It's been quite a year, and you know, brings up a lot of feelings, even watching this film, just thinking about how much has transpired since I began the endeavor with the wonderful support of the National Film Board of Canada and my key collaborator there, Leah Marin. So I just really look forward to listening and learning from others here and reflecting with all of you. So thank you.
You're welcome. But before we listen, we'd like you to hear, I'd like to know how you feel about your film, watching it again, particularly in, let's call it the particular manifestation of democracy in which you find yourself living in the United States in 2020. How does the film feel to you now? Because it seems very prescient as a film made 2 years ago, roughly. So how does it feel to you now to watch it in 2020, particularly in the post-presidential election period?
Well, I mean, the film's genesis is older than that. I began thinking about this film and first proposed it to my producer, Leah, in 2013. And the last day of filming was the fateful day in 2016 when Donald Trump, it was the day after the election. So it's something that I've been working on for such a long time. And, you know, I mean, one thing, this is not something I would have anticipated, but both of the historical places that I focus on, so ancient Athens and then also Siena. So in a very short span of time after the periods I'm looking at, both had massive plagues. So that's it's interesting, I think, to think about what resonates, what you're even able to perceive when you look at the history. So the plague of Athens, you know, had a tremendous effect on Athenian democracy. And much of my interview with Silvia Federici at the time was actually about the impact of the plague on the Middle Ages and how that shifted both the power of workers and actually transformed gender relations and gender dynamics. And so it's quite interesting to think about the material on the cutting room floor and how it resonates in a different way. I mean, as far as, you know, these democratic dilemmas that I raise in the film, I mean, I've tried to make the film in a way so that the stories I tell serve as parables. So I try not to get too bogged down in the specifics of place, so that they would be these kind of stories that I hoped would resonate across time. So these problems of inequality, demagoguery, racism, xenophobia. I mean, you know, what is freedom? What is equality? What is justice? These are timeless themes. So I really, you know, hoped to capture elements that would resonate beyond the present. I think I just didn't quite realize how resonant some of them would be. I mean, in the US, I'm in North Carolina. My parents live here, and it's, you know, this is a state that was downgraded back in 2016 to like not even qualifying as a democracy by some measures. And so we're seeing that, we're seeing that this is a fragile enterprise. Progress can go into reverse, as I say in the opening. And there's just so much work to be done. It almost boggles the mind.
Yes, it's absolutely the case. I'm wondering how much footage you did shoot. You could probably make a long-running Netflix miniseries about.
I'm sorry. My filmmaking style, I have immense respect for people who can go and film for 400 hours and sit and film their subject till their subject falls asleep on the couch. I'm not like that. That's why I make films about ideas, because I don't believe in wasting anything. I mulch everything I shoot. So I almost use all the footage, all the interviews I shot. I didn't film a lot. And then I turn everything into fodder for the book. So everything, I'm an environmentalist, I recycle. Everything gets used in some capacity. But for me, pursuing ideas in cinema allows me to work on a kind of different timescale than following a kind of conventional, or not conventional, but just a human interest narrative where you're really waiting for the subject. And that's just how I've always approached my movies. I've gone for ideas as the star, and just to see how I can use the form to communicate that. So for this film, it was the challenge of mixing the concept of democracy, the theory of democracy, with the practice of it, the fact that it is something that people, that human beings who suffer, who have hopes, who have intense lives that they, live and embody, and to do that mix of telling very personal stories and then also jumping up to the political, and so that their personal stories become these parables. That was the goal, at least.
I'm wondering if just one last question for me before I turn it over to Dr. Terjanian. The kinds of audiences and the response to the film that you've experienced around the world, or perhaps have, for example, have American politicians seen the film, or have politicians from other countries, Greece, for example, have had a chance to experience your film? And I'm just curious about how audiences in different political cultures would examine your work and ask you questions about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I'm trying to think of, I traveled fairly widely with it. So a screening in Portugal comes to mind. It was shown around Portugal quite a bit. And this kind of shock from the audience where they'd go, wow, we're pretty happy with our system here. It was the country where people seemed the most sort of pleased with what they've got. So it just stood out because it was pleasant. In the United Kingdom, for example, there were a lot of issues in the film that were really resonating. So there's, a rising sort of ethno-nationalist turn and issues of inequality and privatization. And I showed the film, for example, in Austria, in Graz, which is actually where Salam wound up. She did manage to reunite with her family. And it was a community group showed the film on their own. And actually then I invited Salam there. So that was a really powerful international screening. So yeah, I think people, we know that some of these problems, the kind of, populist demagoguery is not a problem that is limited to the United States. So I think, a lot of viewers saw their own conditions refracted in the film. But the ones that stand out to me are the places, I guess, where they're sort of grateful, and the film's more of a warning where they're like, let's not go down that road.
Right. Well, thank you again for this wonderful film. I hadn't seen it in a couple of years, so it was great to watch it again.
Thank you.
It is strange context as well, So congrats again on that. And now I'll pass you over to another audience, I suppose, to speak about your work. Please welcome Dr. Anush Terjanian from the University of Ottawa.
Wonderful.
Anush.
Thank you so much, Tom.
You're welcome.
McSorley. It's really lovely to have you here, Astra, and thank you for this soaring and rich and timeless work. I think we will be talking about it for a long time. Au nom du Centre d'études de politique internationale, CIPS, de l'Université d'Ottawa, et du Forum Alex Trebek pour le dialogue, je suis très heureuse de vous souhaiter la chaleureuse bienvenue à toutes et tous nos invités distingués. Nous sommes honorés par votre présence, ainsi que par la présence de vos excellences, mesdames les ambassadrices de l'Arménie, de la France, de la Grèce, du Koweït, du Paraguay, de la Slovénie, Saint Kitts et Nevis et le Zimbabwe, Monsieur l'ambassadeur de la Belgique et les représentants distingués du Cuba et de la Guyane, par l'honorable sénatrice Kim Pate et l'ancienne députée Eleni Bakopanos, par Monsieur le recteur Jacques Frémont, Messieurs les vice-présidents Sylvain Charbonneau et Sani Yaya et Madame la vice-présidente associée Martine Agassé, par nos collègues à Mashkawasi Wogamig, le Centre de ressources autochtones à l'Université d'Ottawa, Miigwech, ainsi que de nombreux invités distingués parvenant d'organismes liés au Parlement et à la société civile. Je souligne la présence d'Akash Maharaj, CEO du Mosaic Institute, Tom Cormier, directeur du Parliamentary Center, Paul Thomas, directeur du Parliamentary Internship Program, et Velma Morgan, chair of Operation Black Vote. De nombreux fonctionnaires, membres des forces armées et responsables politiques. Et surtout, c'est la présence des étudiantes et des étudiants qui nous est très chère. Merci d'être là. We're here in large part because of the generosity and prescience of the much missed alumnus of the University of Ottawa, Alex Trebek, whose devotion to an informed electorate and whose forum for dialogue we hope to honor today through our discussion. It's a great pleasure for me to now introduce our distinguished panelists. Selina Caesar-Chavannes is the Senior Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Advisor at Queen's University's Faculty of Health Sciences. She's also the author of a forthcoming book, Can You Hear Me Now?, coming out with Penguin Canada in February, but ready for pre-order now. And she, of course, brings to our conversation her experience as a member of parliament and legislator, and closer to the executive as a parliamentary secretary to the Minister of International Development and to the Prime Minister. Welcome, Selina. Philippe Fraud est un politicologue à la Faculté des sciences sociales de l'Université d'Ottawa, avec une expertise dans la région du Sahel en Afrique de l'Ouest, se concentrant sur la migration irrégulière et le contrôle des frontières. Among several variously funded projects from SSHRC to the ASRC, Professor Fraud recently won a grant from the Gerda Henkel Foundation to investigate what he is calling security pluralism and the constitution of political authority in West Africa. Cette recherche s'appuie sur son livre récent de Cambridge University Press, Security at the Borders, Transnational Practices and Technologies in West Africa. Bienvenue, Philippe. Larissa Kurtovich is another colleague from the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Social Sciences. A political anthropologist, Professor Kurtovich is at work on at least two fascinating projects. A book entitled Future as Predicament, Political Life After Catastrophe, draws on extensive ethnographic observations, interviews, and historical and media research to chronicle the efforts of Bosnian citizens in Sarajevo and beyond to imagine both the future and the political itself. A second project, Reclaiming Dita, is an intriguing, collaborative graphic ethnography located at a worker-occupied and partially operational detergent factory, Dita, in the city of Tuzla in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Welcome, Larissa. And finally, last but not least, forgive me the cliche, Joshua Nichols is both a philosopher and a law professor at the University of Alberta. His most recent book, A Reconciliation Without Recollection, an investigation of the foundations of Aboriginal law in Canada, thinks through how Canada's constitution rests on the assumption of Crown power over Indigenous nations and communities. The book addresses Canada's failure to remember the Constitution Act's fundamentally colonial foundation. Professor Nichols asks us to look to the past in order to think through the possibility of a meaningful reconciliation. Welcome, Josh. One of the ideas behind this event was to invite discussion of Astra's film in the vicinity of Canada's formal federal democratic institutions, with this bouquet of social scientists, philosophers, and practitioners. Now, the film teaches us a lot about democratic social movements, with perhaps a lesser emphasis on formal representative institutions, though we do learn a great deal from Representative Mickey Michaud about voter suppression from William Barber of the NAACP. Efimia Karakansa reminds us that Athenians elected by lot, and Zoe Konstantopoulou offers words about the 2015 referendum in Greece. But I'd like to begin by exploring our panel's thoughts on this aspect of democracy's meaning. So to Philippe Fraud, if I may begin, Last Sunday, on November 22nd, there were elections in Burkina Faso. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit, drawing on your expertise and on the themes in the film as well, how do these elections raise any questions within or beyond the film? Philippe?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And so I've been following quite closely and kind of following these elections in Burkina Faso and also coming up in Niger through my work and kind of continuing to look at politics in West Africa. And I'm kind of interested to use the kind of comparison, which is an unlikely one, between Burkina Faso and the United States to kind of give myself a bit of optimism about democratic institutions in Burkina Faso. And I think that this is particularly relevant in the case of questions around who can vote, whether we want everyone to vote, and how the electoral system actually includes people. And so I want to be a bit playful, but just kind of explore why I'm a bit optimistic about the process in Burkina Faso. So the way things have gone in the last couple of days is that we've seen that because of insecurity in the north and east of Burkina Faso, roughly 17% of people haven't been able to actually cast a ballot in the national election. The reason I'm optimistic is that the political pressure has been to include everybody's voice, and that it's generally been deplored by parties across the political landscape in that country that everybody is not necessarily able to vote, right? So I do sense that in the inevitable comparison with the United States, as we've seen with debates about voter suppression and the kind of tactic of reducing the electorate rather than winning more of it, that I certainly have a lot of optimism about the kind of democratic norms and the health of those norms in Burkina Faso by comparison. The second point I want to make is about access to democratic institutions. And this is something that I think where, again, the comparison, which we are often hesitant to make between very, very different countries, but I think it's a potentially helpful one, is when we think about the kind of metaphors and understandings of power that we have between kind of global north and global south. And one of the things that's kind of a classic phrasing in the study of African politics is the idea of kind of obtaining power in order to eat, right? That there's a lot of different African political cultures, especially in West and Central Africa, where the metaphor of eating and kind of consuming as a kind of code word for corruption is a way that we describe the kind of political strategies of various elites. I think that that's something that's kind of helpful. It's a bit of a kind of classic in African politics, but it is one that we can transpose when we think about some of the questions around political corruption, which we're often hesitant to actually call that when we look at Western countries. And so I do think that in terms of thinking about democratic institutions, some of these kind of comparative approaches can be quite helpful, not just in kind of exposing and helping us rethink our own institutions here in the West, but also kind of potentially developing some optimism about the resilience of certain democratic norms in the global South.
Excellent. Thank you, Philippe. You know, in our in your remarks, you talked about some aspects of political culture. This metaphor of eating is one that you bring up as an important one for talking about political culture. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about how this cultural system relates to some of the themes that we saw brought up in the film. I'm struck by the opening fresco in Siena of this very patriarchal image, and I wondered if there were elements of the discussion that Silvia Federici and Astra Taylor have that resonated for you.
Yeah, I found that the discussion in that particular context of the kind of beginnings of a kind of market economy, the beginnings of kind of capitalist accumulation really resonated nicely with this kind of idea of power as a form of safeguarding and advancing economic interest. And so I think that idea of the kind of genesis of capitalism, which again, we've seen across political theory and people analyzing the works of Thomas Hobbes, for example, as well as kind of analyzing the beginnings of a market economy. I think that's really, really helpful when we think about these kinds of comparisons that I was alluding to earlier.
Thank you. Well, we have another expert from another part of the world, and that's Larissa Kurtovich, also part of the world undergoing elections. And the spirit behind this discussion is somehow also to try and decenter the American conversation a little bit. So here we are in grand old Ottawa, and I wonder, Larissa, if you can tell us about the ways in which the elections in Bosnia on the 15th of November and the institutions around those elections give us a different understanding of what we would mean by democracy here and now.
So Anush, thank you so much for that question and for that invitation. Thanks so much to Astra Taylor for being here, for making this film, and for doing so much to help us think differently, I think, and act differently. So I'm going to answer your question, Anush, in a way that's a bit circumvent, because I was thinking a lot about the meaning of elections and democracy in relation to Bosnia, and it's in fact very difficult for me to talk about the promise and the figure of democracy in the Bosnian context. So I don't know how much the audience will be familiar with this, but obviously Bosnia was prior to the infamous in 92 through 95 war. It was a part of a socialist country that, from the point of view of the West, was on the other side of things, right? Associated with kind of lack of democracy or even tyranny in some sense. Now, this is not how the generation of my parents experienced life in Yugoslavia, not at all. But, you know, it was in 1990, during the first multi-party elections, that the majority, not a very strong majority, but the majority of Bosnia's citizens brought into power nationalist parties. So this is what I associate the democratic elections with. They brought into power nationalist parties that were subsequently responsible for the war and for the massacres and displacements and the genocide that accompanied that war. So, you know, Cornel West's words about the fascist possibilities of every democratic experiment, I think, cut really deeply for me and resonate in really unsettling ways. And so, you know, in Bosnia, you have the situation, the war ended in the US, in Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, where this peace accords that still doubles as the country's constitution was made and signed. And it created this structure that meant to accommodate these rival nationalist interests within a kind of a democratic state. And this produced a very fragmented form of governance that is really prone to paralysis. Let's say there's 13 different constitutions, parliaments, there's ample opportunity for disagreement, for stagnation, except that the nationalists, who most of the time remain in power to this day, are very efficient at dividing you know, what used to be the socially owned property of the socialist state and the factories and, you know, all of the commons, if you will. So small maneuvers are possible. We saw this a couple of days ago on the November 15th, when the opposition in some parts of the country came together, and I'm talking about left-wing parties coming together with right-wing populists to bring together, you know, the forces. And so they managed to oust in some local elections in the capital of Sarajevo and in Banja Luka, which is the largest Serb-controlled city in the country. They managed to displace these long-standing nationalist parties thanks to this political maneuvering. And, you know, there's hope of a certain kind, and people associate this with a certain kind of a possibility. But just today, we have actually learned that the new mayor of Banja Luka, who belongs to a different Serb nationalist party, you know, has basically spoken against, he's questioned the legitimacy of the Hague verdicts in relation to the rulings on war crimes, including that of Srebrenica. So take that, you know, as you will, you know, whether that's a sign, what kind of a sign that is, and what that might mean. So I have to say that I personally associate elections in particular with risk and disappointment, right? Particularly in times of great historical conjunctures. You know, and at the same time, I really don't want to let go of democracy's promise, and especially democracy in its more substantive forms. I think, you know, those that include meaningful forms of redistribution. Almost everybody in the film spoke about that was that was not divorceable from democracy. It wasn't a question of representation only, and of care, of social justice. And I think that this is the kind of democracy that these days is really in short supply, and perhaps one that has to be fought for.
Excellent. This wonderful fresco of the connections between these formal institutions and the ways in which they don't always serve the end game that we hope for. I think that leads us very neatly into a related question for Josh Nichols. Down the road from here is not only the federal parliament, but also the Supreme Court of Canada. And one of the major institutions of formal not representative, but formal institutions of our democracy are the courts. And I wondered, Josh, if you can tell us a little bit about the rule of law and how we ought to understand it as a means of getting a better understanding of what democracy is. Josh.
Sure, thank you. I think whenever we begin to think about democracy, I think we're very quickly drawn into what we now conceive of as democratic processes of voting. And so there's a tendency to leave courts to the side because they aren't democratic institutions in that sense. And yet without a separation of powers in an institutional culture that allows for law to not be basically ripped up and thrown out with every new majoritarian government, then there is no memory and no context for a society to have democratic processes. And so I think that we have to really think about the rule of law as a place in which the social democratic memory of a place is accumulated and accountable, so that legislation can enter into a constitutional order, but it doesn't enter in simply as it's written, right? That is not what makes it law. What makes it law is how courts fit it into an existing body of law and practices and make it into a living constitutional order. And that requires courts to have independence from the executive and from the legislative branches. If courts are simply creatures of the executive and the legislative body, especially in a Westminster system where there's very little separation between the executive and the legislative bodies to begin with, then you have problems like show trials, and really you lose all sense of democracy, you lose all sense of history very quickly. And in Canada, it has been the courts that are often the repository of memory and the staging point for minority groups and minority nations to articulate their positions and struggle back against the tidal waves of majoritarian politics within democracies. So it really is what prevents the tyranny of the majority, which is not democratic at all. And so thinking about democracy not as a set of voting practices, but a deliberative practice of solving collective self-governance problems along the lines of someone like John Dewey, I think is a better way to sort of clear that out and see that the courts have a fundamental role to play, and to not see them as an illegitimate source just because they're not voted in. But yeah, thank you.
Does that, Josh, put you in alignment with Cornel West's discussion at the end? I think actually it was more in the beginning when he was talking about how some of the major changes, for example, when he was referring to the Platonic challenge, some of the major changes towards justice were not made by majoritarian institutions. Does this mean that this is a vision that you would endorse?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Dr. West was setting up a kind of like an interesting challenge by referring to the Grand Inquisitor at the end there in Thrasymachus out of the Republic. And I think, his own work has responses to that. I mean, he's framing the problem up, but he also understands the nature of the response. And the courts have a big element in that response, because the response is that if that version of raw arbitrary power was what people really want, that they didn't want to self-govern, then the models of arbitrary power wouldn't need to use the words of justice. They wouldn't have to use those norms. They'd be able to make an open offer, right? Public slavery for these benefits. They can't make an open offer. And so because of that, and that courts play a key role in that, because they are the accountability for law, not only in terms of its validity, in terms of how it's passed, but its warrant, right? How it is accountable to factual situations, how it is accountable to social memory. And so I think that kind of challenge from Thrasymachus or from the Grand Inquisitor is quickly overturned when power has to explain itself in the normative terms of concepts like justice, and has to map its behavior in relationship to those. Courts have a key role in shaming power back into line.
Well, I think that gives us a very nice segue into my question on formal representative institutions for Selena. Courts may have a role in shaming governments back into line, but what do members of parliament? What is the role of members of parliament? And what is your experience in our House of Parliament? How did it help you understand what the meaning of democracy might be?
So first, I just want to thank you, Astra, and thank the everybody involved in this panel, and Astra in particular. Sorry, and Astra in particular for directing the film. You know, I just want to touch on Joshua's last point before I go into this one, because I mean, when Dr. West talked about Brown versus the Board of Education, and that the courts had to sort of shame into making sure that that happened and there was desegregation of schools, we have to remember that that was led up to by the civil rights movement, that there were people that were involved in that that movement towards that change when we think about voter rights acts and different things. So I'll talk a little bit to that later. But when we think about the role of our own system and our politicians within that role, and when we go back to the original question about democratic institutions and suppression and other things, I'd like to follow sort of how Philippe started answering the question, and really talk about, you know, who can vote, do we want everyone to vote, and who gets excluded from voting. And we do have to remember, like, we really are consuming a lot of oxygen from American media, and we're seeing what's happening, long lines at the polling stations, people dancing at the lines, you know, the removal of hundreds, and we heard in the movie, hundreds of ballots in certain polling stations in certain jurisdictions. But we have to remember, during the 42nd Parliament here in Canada, we had something called the Fair Elections Act, or what we termed later on the Unfair Elections Act, which removed or prohibited voter identification cards, which severely suppressed the vote, or would suppress the vote for, you know, students, Indigenous people who lived in rural areas, and seniors. The legislation also eliminated vouching. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of individuals who use this form along with the ID cards to be able to cast their ballot. There was also a silencing of the chief electoral officer, which of course tells us about the election, tells us nonpartisan information about where we should go, how we should vote, things like that. And so during the 42nd Parliament, which I was very honored to be a part of, parts of that legislation were taken back or repealed. But we also have to think about, and again, I'm going to borrow from Philippe, access. And representation matters. People need to see themselves in represented within their democracy, their democratic institutions. And, you know, unfortunately, we still in Canada have one of the lowest representatives of women within our democratic institutions. When we think about to the 42nd Parliament that I was a part of, the only Black female from all parties out of 338 people. In the last election, the 43rd Parliament, no Black females were elected. And very recently we had Marcy Ian, and of course not elected yet, but the leader of the Green Party, Anna-May Paul, who is leading that party. So we're starting to see that, but we really don't have, in terms of numbers, that representation that actually allows people to feel that they're part of a process that really can do right by them. So when we talk about people having apathy toward our democracy, when we talk about people feeling disenfranchised, we have to really think about why they feel that way. Are they seeing themselves in the process, and are they seeing the people that we vote for to be their representative, to be their voice in Parliament, actually doing what they need as people, as vulnerable populations, as marginalized populations? And so there's kind of a disconnect there. And I think we have a system that is flawed, and I'll probably get into how I think we could bring some equilibrium back to them, or some equity back to that. But we have a system that is really one that people are not quite seeing themselves in, especially the people that need help the most from our government.
Well, I think, these are, you've allowed us for a very nice transition to this next part of our discussion, Selena, because, one of the other very important themes of the film is this challenge that both Wendy Brown and actually most of the characters in the film, and also Cornel West, suggest is posed by Plato, by Dostoevsky, by James Baldwin, and at the core of democratic theory, which is, are the people self-governable, right? Who are they beyond the fictions or the frescoes, to take on the opening image of the film, that we paint for ourselves about what democracy ought to be? And you raised just now in your remarks, Selena, this disjuncture that you see between the image that we have and the actual technology, the actual practice and experience of representation in our formal institutions. But I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about this other side of the question, this challenge posed by Cornel West through Plato, Dostoevsky, and James Baldwin is what, given the fact that he talks about these two original sins of American democracy, first of all, dispossession of indigenous people, and then the sin of slavery, these two key fundamental features that make up the experience and lives of people in the U.S. continent, and in the United States, but also on our entire continent. What are the ways in which you think the Canadian demos relates?
It relates completely, except that a lot of our history is erased from the consciousness of Canadians, erased from our history books. So the 260 years of slavery in this country has never been acted upon, is not in, we don't read it in grade 1 to 8. We don't hear about it. And it's not in our history books. In fact, the Ontario Black History Society did a very recent campaign, Blacked Out History, where they looked at a history book and looked at the number of pages out of a 200+ page book that will relate to Black history. And there's only 13 pages with it. So when we think about that, and I'm going to quote a little bit from Astra's book, where she said the Republic did not consider the majority of its residents to be members of the polity. Enslaved Indigenous people, women, poor white men, certain immigrants. Like, this is also in Canada. So when you have a system or a democratic institutions that were created on the omission of certain people being persons, on the omission of certain people, and then reinforced the legislation, the policy, the regulations that they've been enacted throughout their legacy, reinforced that dehumanization of those individuals, the Indian Act, residential schools, segregation of schools, which the last segregated school, I believe, ended in 1986. I was 12, right? Like, it's not like years and years ago, right? And it's racist immigration policy toward Black people. You have these systems reinforcing the fact that certain people are not really wanted. They don't really belong in this system. And then all of a sudden, in present day, we're like, well, let's all get involved. Well, I'm sorry. How does that quite add up? How does it add up when, and I think when the film went to Miami and was speaking to a woman named Aja, she was quite blunt about, like, give me a break. This does not seem to involve me. Now, I'm not going to be the Selena that just totally rags on the whole thing, because I do believe that, our democracy kind of ebbs and flows. As I said, it's flawed, right? But then we do have what I believe the great equalizer of our democracy, which is the power is not centralized on Parliament Hill or in the legislature somewhere. We believe that it is, and we believe every 4 years we go and vote, and that is our democracy. What I believe our democracy is the great equalizer to that flawed system is the power of the people that, like Black Lives Matter, that protest and ensure that our criminal punishment system has some degree of equity in it, like individuals like Velma Morgan, who's on with Operation Black Vote, who tries to encourage more people of color, Black individuals, to participate in our democratic institutions. Kika Ojo-Thompson, who in Toronto, who is constantly advocating for our children in the welfare system. We have Black parents who have advocated and ensured that our children are no longer de-streamed or streamed into programs that won't allow them to go to university. We have doctors right now who are advocating for individuals to have better health outcomes. That is the great equalizer, the ability of the people to decide that they're going to push political will in a way that actually brings equity to the people that they serve is, I believe, the great equalizer to our flawed current system.
It's a hopeful conclusion.
I do have a little bit of hope.
It's wonderful to hear, and I wondered if we could turn to Larissa too to build on these ideas.
Absolutely.
There's this similar paradox that is raised. Wendy Brown raises it for us. Silvia Federici does a bit too in the film. It's the Rousseauvian paradox. Can we make democracy out of an undemocratic people? One of the texts that gets trotted out are, in Canada, we love Václav Havel, and in his Summer Meditations, he speaks a lot about the power of art and otherwise to create and help foster a culture of democracy as something that is lived. I wondered if you could tell us what you think about that.
So as you know, I'm trying to avoid the Havel question because as many post-socialist subjects of my generation, I do hold a little bit of a grudge against his generation for not being prescient enough to realize that the democracy that they were fighting for did not, for them, I mean, the social justice, redistributive politics, all of these other things kind of got left by the wayside. And so this is one of the kind of, I guess, paradoxes of Eastern European history in the last, sort of 30 or so years. But I was going to return to this question of, the people as democratic or undemocratic. I think it was Wendy Brown who used this term, and I respect her, and I love her work so much. But I mean, I would respectfully disagree. I think that this idea that a people is democratic or undemocratic, as if this was a characteristic that one could kind of identify, is also not in some ways. It's not really how I see things unraveling as an anthropologist who goes into the field and talks to people about political thinking and action. I think that, Rousseau was right in many ways that, a democratic subject is not born, but has to be made, right? And you just named some of these functions through which that process can actually take place. Certainly schooling and education are paramount in this. But it's not just that, it's also the types of relationships that we surround ourselves with, the kinds of relationality that we can develop, our historical knowledge, how embedded we are in our communities, like who are we exposed to, who do we talk to, whose experiences are we able to actually learn from. And so Selena's point about, the lack of kind of historical consciousness is really well taken. I think that there is this sense in which, just as the democratic subject is a product of a certain kind of a historical process and a certain intention, undemocratic subjects are also made through particular kinds of histories, right? Whether those are histories of, settler colonialism, whether these are histories of, chattel slavery and all of the violences that we have been thinking about. So, but I think that judging from the experience of Bosnia, because we, in the aftermath of war, there was an attempt at promoting democracy through these very top-down processes, right, of building civil society, of, that effort, which was so costly in terms of effort, in terms of time, in terms of funds, ended up producing this very elitist, kind of circle of people who are dependent on international funding and whom the local people really understand as merchants of fog, right? So there is this sense of alienation from that process. So I think that, the crucial point for me here is that, if we're talking about building a kind of a democratic way of life, a democratic set of sensibilities and orientations, these things have to resonate with local histories and, local sensibilities. And they have to do so in a way that acknowledge past wrongs and that have to really kind of reckon with these difficult questions, because otherwise what we have is a kind of a shallow performance, that leaves a lot of people behind.
It's in many ways then you are folding into this very important concept of democracy from below and democracy from the people that Selena is alluding to. I have hundreds of questions to give you, but it occurs to me that our audience may also be ready to start asking questions. So if you have a question, we ask that you type it in the Q&A section of the Zoom, that you please keep it brief, and that you please introduce yourself. We won't be able to ask questions unless people introduce themselves. Donc, on vous invite aussi de poser vos questions en français. On serait très heureuse de les traduire pour le panel. Et on vous invite de vous présenter lorsque vous demandez vos questions dans la section Q et A de votre écran Zoom. Et on vous remercie beaucoup de les garder bref, s'il vous plaît. Donc, building on this idea of who the people are, and this challenge that posed by Plato and others, I wonder, we do get one answer, and this is in the refugee camp, the extremely beautiful scenes and poignant and very moving scenes there. We meet Abid Muhajir, who is from Pakistan through Afghanistan. And he, when asked by Astra what democracy means, he tells us very clearly that it's justice. It's not freedom. Freedom for him is something that he balks at as a concept. And I wondered, Philippe, if you might be able to tell us a little bit about how you understand what he says and how it relates to the work that you do on West Africa.
Yeah, I'm kind of, that particular interview really it took me back to some of this kind of foundational split in international relations between the kind of domestic sphere and the international sphere, and the ways that justice gets compartmentalized within the state, within the sort of individual political community. And I couldn't help but think, watching the interview with him, but also looking at the segments about the Greek debt crisis and the interaction between Greek democracy and EU technocracy, I could not help but see this pattern repeated again and again. This idea that within the state is the sphere of justice, representativeness, pure democracy, And outside the state, the international sphere is a sphere in a sense of freedom, but a sphere of freedom that is somewhat negative. I think Wendy Brown also pointed to this in her comments in the documentary. This idea that the international sphere lacks these kinds of rules of political order that we might have prevailing within our domestic society. And there's a kind of absence of justice, but a prevalence of this kind of negative freedom. So I found that relatively interesting in terms of how we see democracy as freedom and what the limits are, again, the limits at the border of the state between freedom and justice. I just want to build a little bit and kind of be a sort of amateur political theorist a little bit on this question of justice and what it requires of us as citizens. And I think that one of the things that we see across the kind of canon of political philosophy as a kind of conversation through time about these questions of justice is, whether it's in Plato, whether it's in Alexis de Tocqueville, whether it's in Rousseau, the idea that we need to be trained, we need to train ourselves. Plato mentions mind and body in terms of the training of the philosopher. We need to train ourselves to pursue justice and to pursue these kinds of democratic ideals. And so there's elements of that that are reflected throughout the film. And I think in particular about, you know, when we see the kind of Greeks assembled in the streets of Athens, right? Relatively spontaneously around a political movement around the Greek referendum. So again, these questions of where is it that we get this kind of training in terms of the pursuit of democratic ideals? It's in these forms of assembly. I was looking just a little bit earlier at some statistics as well about, from the New York Times, about how many Americans participated in some form of Black Lives Matter protest throughout 2020. The estimates are between 15 and 26 million. So again, when I think of, well, what is the democratic training that we get? It's that precise form of taking a stand and assembling publicly, visibly, to demand some kind of change. The final point I want to make about this question of democratic participation and where we get our training was, again, coming back to a moment in the film where there is a young girl in an after-school program in Miami who spontaneously comes up with a very eloquent and catchy critique of the relationships of power that she and her classmates are engaged in. And again, being an amateur political theorist, all I could think of was the kind of, again, the practice in terms of building up the sort of social mores of democracy, but also the distinction that Machiavelli makes between virtue and fortuna, right? One, political skill, but secondly, the ability to translate that skill into some kind of political change. And I saw her intervention as a phenomenal example of virtue in action, this ability to spontaneously conjure political change and political speech. But I also felt, maybe pessimistically, that perhaps she did not have the fortuna that others might have to have that speech recognized and taken up. But I want to end on an optimistic note, which is that democracy has a lag time, justice has a lag time. The people who participate in the BLM protests in 2020, in 2030, may be in a completely different situation. Again, as we see with the Women's March, for example, in Washington, DC in 2016, we saw not long after that a large number of women getting involved and getting elected to office in the midterm elections in 2018. So the lag time of democracy is something that enables maybe that young girl in Miami to maybe end up in a position that we might not expect 10 years from now.
Well, Philippe, you have with much sprezzatura brought Machiavelli into the conversation. And I know that there's someone else that probably Josh is chomping at the bit to talk about here in this section, perhaps. And that might be John Dewey, if I'm right. But I wondered, Josh, if you would want to speak to this question of the possibility of the formation of a culture. Do the institutions need to come first, or does the culture need to come first if we are going to better understand and or better practice democracy?
Well, I think that sort of playing off what other panelists have touched on about history and memory and the amnesia of the creation of a mythology for a state. And I think that when we talk about aims of justice, and it was Abid Mujahir's comments in the film that actually stood out the most to me, because he cuts against a concept of freedom that really goes back to how Hobbes was responding to the humanist tradition by redefining freedom. Freedom prior to Hobbes was, the humanist tradition had it as a form of self-government. It was a very different conception. He reconfigured it to be lack of interference. So he had a very different concept of freedom, and to hear justice fronted against that notion of freedom, I think resonates strongly. And when we think about the Canadian context and we think about memory and absence of memory, I think we can turn our attention to the secession reference and the kind of picture of Canadian constitutional history that the court gave us, where they positioned Indigenous peoples in this country as a positive example of Canada's long tradition for respecting minority rights. And that requires a lot of historical amnesia, right? And it's very interesting that that decision cuts off its historical memory around 1867 and really does try to recharacterize what happens in the British North America Act of 1867 as if it was a Republican founding like France and the United States, which it definitely wasn't. It was a reconfiguration of the British Empire. And it was a complete breach of promises with Indigenous peoples that they would be able to govern themselves on their lands, as it was a breach to French Canada, right? And that kind of historical memory or absence thereof makes justice impossible. And I think that comes back to Selena's point about Brown v. Board and the kind of legal activism that it took to bring that case up. And courts are a venue. They're not, they go both ways. Right? So for every Brown v. Board, you have slaughterhouse cases, right? They disassemble the very possibility of the Reconstruction governments and bring in Jim Crow. But they do so by forgetting and elevating legal language in ways that is unclear, right? We go to Dred Scott and the way that you could have a categorical separation of the concepts of freedom and property and sort human beings into two different concepts and act as if that made any sense. And I think that's why courts are so valuable, is because we can go to them. We don't need to be voted in to go to them. We can bring cases and we can embarrass power by saying, tell me again how people are sorted into these two words. Explain to me. And eventually that wears down and creates the possibility of change that can shift over from the political realm and back to the legal realm. And it tends to be this seesaw movement that goes through, especially the English systems. You know, and that's a product of the English Civil War and how they divided power in their response to absolute monarchy and that history. But for me, I think it is that long process of pushing for justice, using the tools of ordinary human language against abstractions. So, thank you.
And so, but Josh, can I press you a little bit on that?
Sure.
Or can you help explain a little bit more about actually the accessibility to the court system? You know, I would love for you to spell that out, because of course there may be also mythologies and fictions there as well, and how do they affect your argument?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, I think that the health of a body politic can often be measured in how accessible and public its courts are. And so the less accessible they become, the more clogged the arteries become, the harder it is to get cases through. And it's a long arc even with fairly open courts, right? We want to point to an example. Let's consider the struggle for Indigenous rights post 1982. Like the first court case that we get to define Section 35 is 1990 with Sparrow, and by no means a happy decision. A partial victory still upholds the idea that the crown, there was never any doubt that the crown was sovereign, had legislative power, and underlying title. Now that lack of doubt by the court doesn't make much sense, because it actually doesn't even square with how the tradition of British constitutionalism conceives of the balance of power between the sovereign and the courts, right? It would create a notion of power that was self-given and therefore cut against the doctrine of continuity. That has taken 30 years to get to this point where it seems as if the courts are not knowing exactly what the move is next in Section 35 litigation. You can see that in Mikisew Cree 2, where the court is beginning to split post-McLaughlin on what the meaning of Section 35 is. And what this example shows us is that you can always thread things through the courts until they shut their doors, right? But the arc of change is going to be a long and tough one. It's not an easy thing, and institutional design is just not going to be your savior. You're going to have to, like, there was a report by the Yellowhead Institute about Indigenous success rates on injunctions, and it's abhorrent. There are no injunctions that we get anymore, right? It's all done through the duty to consult, which allows the action to continue, right, as the litigation is going forward. So but showing these out and fleshing them out is part of this process of making our democracies, our constitutions, living practices, as opposed to being governed by the dead hand of formal institutions.
Well, on this concept of living, and since many of you are already very much interested in your own work and in your practices, in thinking in sophisticated ways about the future, I'd like to take one of the questions that we've had by an Eileen Carter, who asks the question, which is in many ways the elephant in the room. I think now it's a variation of the question that is, you know, what do we do about democracy now that we're living in this current situation? Is it a blip, or is it a something that is a feature that we will have to contend with? And to ask us to think a little further beyond about your predictions for democracy in the next 20 or 30 years, she asks. So the first part of the question is my own addition, and she is Ms. Carter asks us to think about the 20 or 30 years. Who would like to go first? Who would like to give a stab at this? Go, please, Selena.
So yeah, I'll give a stab at the first part of it, which is now, and then in 20 to 30 years. So now we're living through, of course, a global pandemic, conversations about race, all within the backdrop of climate change and all other social, political, and economic sort of shocks to our systems. And we know that all three of those, COVID, racial inequality, climate change, impacts the poorest and most vulnerable in our globe, here in Canada and around the world, especially in the global south. And those individuals happen to look like people like me. And so when we know that our democracy has tentacles in every facet of our lives, at the close of the movie, you know, the conversation about it being in our bedrooms. And when I watched it with my children, they were like, yes, when it comes to women's rights. And, you know, they were really excited about saying, you're darn right it does. But, you know, Larissa talked about leaving no one behind. And in this particular climate, when we're talking about these really disruptive shocks to our systems, we need to ensure that our democratic institutions are stable enough such that they do leave no one behind. And I want to call into question, you know, not only the fact that we have 70 million plus individuals who are displaced in our world, so who have no rights, that live in these camps, often an average of 20 to 25 years. You know, what happens, what is going to happen when we think about 20 to 30 years from now? How does that continue when we see bodies washing up on a beach, when we see closing of borders, when we see these conversations, when there's this polarization of our political systems? How do we start to think about ourselves? How do we start to think about people who actually need us to stand up for our democracies, for ensuring that our democracy thrives? And when we think about, if I could bring it just home for 1 second, when we think about COVID, for example, right now, we had in April a provincial government that did not want to collect race-based data. We had a municipal government that did collect race-based data. And we saw the disparities in Toronto of 52% of the population being racialized, but being 78% impacted by COVID-19. If our governments are not paying attention to what is happening now with these drastic shocks to every system, health, justice, you name it, if they're not paying attention now in a way that really focuses in on the growing disparities between our populations, what is going to happen 20, 30 years from now when the majority, so to speak, is no longer the majority? What is going to happen to our democratic institutions? We really need to start thinking about how either we have more civic engagement, and Paul Brennan put a question in there about that, the capacity to have dialogue. You're absolutely right. We need to have those people with lived experience at the table. We are not the know-it-alls, the politicians. We are not the ones who harbor all the information that's available to change our systems. We need to have people at the table who can marry those experiences and ensure that our policies actually help them, and ensure that 20 or 30 years from now, we're not at protests because we're having conversations about racial inequality. We're not still trying to save the planet. You know, we're doing things in the right way to ensure that we have equity in our systems. And like the gentleman said at the end of the movie, that there's justice, that there's fairness for people who really, really need it right now.
Well, this brings us to another question from a philosophy student at the University of Ottawa, Samuel de Brouwer, who asks along those lines, should we understand democracy as a never-ending question? Or is it in any way something stable and attainable? And I would add, is that something that we would possibly want? These are questions that the film asks us to ponder as well. And I wondered if one of our panelists would like to pursue that a little more. I'm going to ask Philippe.
Just about to raise my hand, so that's perfect. I've been thinking a little bit about this kind of this question of there was a question about, you know, where do we think we're going in 20, 30 years? And also kind of, I think it does tie nicely to this other question as well about like as democracy as a constant struggle. And the theme that I want to kind of focus on in particular is the question of privacy and surveillance. Because I think that, again, as we've seen with the rise of big tech companies, but also just advancements in terms of algorithmic governance, we do face a situation in which threats to privacy and the ease of kind of mass surveillance do pose a threat to democratic practices. So I'll just kind of go to my kind of research area of interest, which is, again, I've looked a little bit at questions around border controls and border security and ID and these types of issues in West Africa. And in those contexts, technologies of surveillance are sold as tools with which to embrace a sort of modern future. And in fact, just better secure elections and give people stable identity to participate in the democratic process. Sure, so we can leave that to one side. I think that, however, when we look at you know, some of the Snowden revelations in the last decade as well, we do see that there is a risk to the kinds of practices that we associate with democracy around freedom of assembly and conscience and so on that come from restrictions on privacy and the increase in governmental surveillance. I just want to kind of be a little optimistic about this as well, which is that this is a kind of double dance, right? There are two partners in this kind of question around privacy and surveillance and threats to it, and the ways that people adapt to that. So I think we saw some good examples of that when we think about the protests in Hong Kong recently. When we see the state increase repressive powers, we do see a kind of corresponding adaptation of democratic movements. And so there are sources of optimism when we think about predictions for the future and when we think about democracy as a kind of ongoing struggle in that particular respect.
Excellent. I mean, this ties into this question that we have from Paul Brennan that Selena referred to beforehand, which asks about how the ways in which we can get beyond voting to start thinking about democracy as something that is an ongoing, engaging process. I'd like to also bring up a question of a colleague of ours at the Faculty of Social Sciences, Ruby Darer, from the School of International and Global Studies, she asks about one of the questions that issues that comes from the documentary is the different ways, and that's something that we bring up ourselves. We have brought up in just the constitution of this panel, that democracy is defined and understood differently by different societies or parts of societies. And she invites us to think about how in international development, one vision, imposing a single vision, is something that's seen as highly problematic. And is it possible, she asks, that many of the failures of democracy are linked to the fact that there is a disconnect between bottom up and top down, and that we are missing the much needed social exercise to define what the society wants, needs, or desires? And I wonder if I can ask Larissa to give a try at this question. And I would also, just before I give Larissa a little time to think it through.
I was wondering if Josh also wanted to answer this one, just to kind of leave it open, but I'm happy to take it as well.
If any of them in the audience, we also have agreed to answer questions. So si quelques-uns ou quelques-unes d'entre vous voudraient demander une question directement à la metteur en scène, elle est là, elle est disponible pour vous aussi. So Larissa or Josh, please.
Well, I mean, I was going to say that one not need leave the borders, go into an international context to see this unitary kind of a dominant vision of democracy and everything else being imposed on people. I mean, we, in the Canadian context, we see that playing out as well. I think that, there is this question of the imposition of a certain kind of a vision of how the society ought to be, like this normative vision that's deeply associated, I think, with political modernity. This idea that there is one way, right? And one kind of a right way of going about. So democracy itself becomes a kind of a tool of civilization, of a civilizing mission, which we know is deeply violent, right? I mean, not only in symbolic, but in very concrete ways. And so I think that we really need to rethink, right, this vision of a unitary, of a single kind of a democracy. I think that this is part of the danger. And I don't mean that this means that anything goes, right? And that we can relativize everything, and that everybody can live in their own truth, in their own kind of realm. But I do think that, histories matter. I mean, I'm an anthropologist, history's embeddedness, relationships, very specific kinds of, conflicts also. Democracy is a ground of struggle. There is no consensus, and perhaps it's good that there is no consensus, because what is the alternative? I am afraid to think about the alternative, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I could speak to that. I think that we have to be very cautious whenever we begin to drift towards using formalistic definitions of terms, things like democracy, as if they float outside of history. I like a way that Nietzsche would use to talk about concepts, that if concepts have histories, they don't have definitions. And that if you try to provide a formal definition, then you're trying to hide the fact that it actually has a particular history, and you're trying to impose it as a universal standard. Now, the logic of that was the standard of civilization. It was the foundations of the architecture of what is modern international law now. And so this whole top-down projection about what a state is, as if it's a preconceived package of institutions that then get projected into a space, and then people that begin to absentmindedly occupy and learn, is part of this historical amnesia that, like, every peoples have their own constitutional histories, their own processes of democratic will formation, solving problems collectively. And if we begin to stop thinking of it as a set of formal definitions that things have to fit into, as if and not asking ourselves the question, where are we getting these standards from? They have to have a basis somewhere. And just actually using philosophy once in a while, instead of just talking about it, to unpack these kinds of problems, and to remember that, like, concepts like truth, like they can be easily weaponized, but truth is relative to a language, right? And it has to then be, if it wants to be communicated across linguistic barriers, you then have to do the process of translation, and translation requires both parties to revise their terms. This is the work of Quine and Davidson, right? Like, this is American pragmatism 101. It's very basic. And yet we get lost in abstractions about this is what democracy is, and the world has to fit it. And if it doesn't, there's a problem. It's very easy to learn definitions, and it's very easy to weaponize them. It's harder to do the actual work of remembering where they come from.
Anush, do you mind if I just jump in with one small comment about this? Yeah, so you know, I really appreciate where Josh was going with his response there, because I'm often reminded that, you know, Ghana, for example, is a little over, their democracy is almost a little over 60 years old. Ghana is younger than my parents. Like, we really need to think about how we transport what we are defining, as long as our history is, and as flawed as our history is, into other jurisdictions. Like, we stand on this moral high ground of you know, of being so much more civilized, forgetting, as Josh says, that there was colonialism that happened in places that were civilized, that they took that civilization, said they weren't civilized, came up with the ideology of race, then decided to demonize people. And so if we are going to transplant these ideas of democracy in places around the world, we really need to do a deep dive in the history of our responsibilities and a history of our actions in those places, and then decide, well, do we even want to go there? Because if we look at, you know, for example, the United States at this moment, I mean, I'm not sure if I want their definition of whatever is going on down there to be transplanted somewhere else. And they're how many years old? So just let's be clear about making sure that we're not playing with democracy the way we play with international aid, or we play with missionary work, where we go in and we're going to fix the problem over there when we don't even know how to fix it for ourselves.
Well, I mean, I'm very tempted now to see if our director would like to ask a question of the panelists, because on some levels, but she doesn't have to, because on some level, I feel like her voice is fixated by the film, and I didn't know if there was anything that this group might inspire in you to ask, or if you wanted to just to add some comments to the questions that we've been receiving.
I mean, I just want to say how incredible this has been, and it's been such a pleasure to have as an amateur political theorist, to have this conversation and to listen to you all, and for the perspectives you're bringing, and you're making so many brilliant points. I suppose, I mean, I'd love people to maybe touch on the economy more directly, and the fact that we live in a capitalist world, because that was a thread I tried to weave in there, and just, you can't separate these two in my view. And, you know, addressing that, it seems as overwhelming as addressing the problems of our democracy, if we can even separate them. So I wanted to bring a kind of, bring in the notion of the economy and how you see that playing in. I mean, my work as an activist is focused on economic justice. I'm trying to find a new way to organize people to build economic power, because my feeling is that in a way the problems flow from that. So I focus on organizing debtors on the grounds that under conditions of financialized capitalism, you know, people have to debt finance more and more things. That's more prevalent in the economy, and that opens up new ways for us to organize, build power, and create new kinds of identity that actually cut across the sort of predictable ones, right? So people hold debts in common. They're young, they're old, they're black and white, they're gay, they're straight, they're urban, they're rural, and that's, you know, day to day. That's where I'm throwing down in my organizing, and trying to build solidarity. Solidarity is my term, is the term I come back to when we're talking about how do we create democratic subjects? How do we do that? How do we actually get the motion towards a more democratic horizon? Well, you have to have solidarity, a transformative solidarity that changes who you are and who you're in relationship with, so you can change the structures. So yeah, I just want to ask you that simply, where do you see capitalism fitting into this? And do we have to name it as a problem directly and tackle it as well? But thank you all so much. I really have enjoyed this. And thank you, Anush, for putting this together. I know it was a lot of work, and I'm so appreciative of everyone's time.
So wonderful that you're here, Astra. And it's I think it's probably a confirmation bias problem on my part, because it's my own field of research. So I've overcompensated by not asking about it. But I would love to hear from Larissa. I mean, you're doing this incredible graphic. It's not a novel, it's a graphic ethnography. I invite you all to find Larissa's webpage and look at it, Reclaiming Dita.
Yes, reclaimingdita.com, I think, www, the standard stuff. Would you like me to start answering? Did you want to add something? So I no longer hear you for some reason.
Pardon?
Oh, I'm saying I'd love to hear from you. Hear from you. That'd be great.
Oh, I just lost you for a second. I didn't hear anybody. So
can you hear?
With a lag, I hear you. But I was wondering, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was just asking, should I go for it?
Go for it.
Okay. So this is the greatest question of all, right? This is the most important question of all, because and I just want to say my students rock, because some of them are asking these great questions as well, and I just want to say that I love my students, and they make everything meaningful in a particular way. But this, when Eileen asked this question about where we see ourselves, where we see the democracy, democratic practice, and thinking in 20 to 30 years, the things that I was thinking about really had to do with the question of what will happen with the economy, with people's livelihoods in very particular kinds of ways. So you see what financialization of capitalism, when we live in this kind of a deep, late capitalism that we don't actually understand, most of us, I think, that is in the business of abstraction, right? To go back to Josh's point about the abstraction as violence, right? That creates a kind of a situation where people are no longer able to discern where the violence is exactly coming from, because it seems to be coming from everywhere. So one of the things, obviously, is just the incredible difficulty of making a livelihood, making a living these days, of incredible rates of debt among the new generation. And this promises to continue, obviously. And I see it in my students, they're so exhausted by capitalism, and by the constant pressures of, succeeding, being productive, having all of their ducks in a row in a particular kind of a sense, and how depleting this is. And on the other hand, these spectacular accumulations of wealth on the other side, right, which, are basically disinterested in the social as a realm, right? So I wonder, this is the question: what will happen there in this conflict? How will the conflict become actualized? What kinds of solidarity, are possible? And this is why I so deeply appreciate Astra's work on debtors unions, right? And this is one of the zones of conflict, one of the zones of struggle. But also things like, what will happen with the increased, the disappearance of jobs as we know them, right? And with the sort of inability, the rising forms of precarity in the United States, the incredible costs of healthcare for people. I mean, like the sense that life has become untenable in many ways under capitalism. And, and in some ways, yeah, in Canada, there's OHIP and other kinds of things. But I mean, there's real precarity, real underemployment, disemployment. People are struggling. And now in the conditions of the pandemic, what does that mean? And at the same time, you see how big money enters politics, right? How it basically, occupies, everything and sucks the life out. So I think out of everything. So I'm really, when we ask this question, what will happen in 20 to 30 years, it's really about that. Whether we're going to be able to regain or recuperate that kernel, that possibility of a more just, socioeconomically more just world.
Wonderful. We have another question from, is this a student of yours, Larissa? Alex Karabatsos? No, is it a student of someone else's? Who's yes, who's asking us a question about this concept of nous et les autres, of us and ourselves, the Todorov question, which in many ways, asks us to develop a bit the idea about whether democracy really has to always exclude people by default. And I don't know who would like to address this point. I can't see. Sorry, you're all small all of a sudden. Could someone raise your hand in a big way?
Go ahead, Larissa.
Larissa, would you like to answer?
I don't want to monopolize, but I do have a response to this, because I think what Wendy Brown is asking is about scale, and about the fact of how to make the democratic decision-making possible at, can you do it really at the level of a kind of a global, a scale without, without making it too abstract on some level. And I think that's the question of, can we, if you think of things that are grassroots, of things that are bottom up, they tend to be smaller scale, that they tend to be grounded in a specific history, specific location, specific type of struggle. And the more you push it, outside, it becomes a lot more abstract, I think, in some ways. So that's all I'll say.
Well, and there's another question that has come up that has asked us about whether in very recent geopolitical contexts, we have seen democracies being crushed by authoritarian powers. And the question asks, are democracies impotent? And what makes them lack power or not? I wondered if somebody would address this question as well.
Sure, maybe I'll respond to that. I mean,
for me, I'm already it's implicitly tied to the previous question. I think I'm imposing my own response on the stakes of exclusion to power. But anyway, please.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it was actually the last question that, and I think they do tie together quite nicely. And for me, questions about exclusion and necessity around democracy are ones we have to approach with the utmost caution, because they are what are fatal to democracy, almost right off the get-go. I think Arendt in Origins of Totalitarianism has her finger right on the point when she says that the road to totalitarianism starts as soon as someone's legal personhood they are deprived of it. Right. And that is the boundaries of a legal community. So as soon as you make that exclusionary move, and how you make that exclusionary move, what justifies it, how you reason that way through, will be the foundational amnesia that will lead you to your own demise under really the rise of arbitrary power, which kills off democracies. And we should remember that the rise of fascism in Western Europe was always done through democratic means, right? And so it's not that democracy is impotent. It's actually, I think, the tradition of Western political philosophy has it right when it says that arbitrary power or tyranny contains the seeds of its own demise. It can't maintain continuity. It can only give orders from the top, and those orders won't make sense, so it naturally falls apart. I mean, its fate is pretty much written out in Alice in Wonderland when Humpty Dumpty has a dialogue with Alice. Humpty Dumpty says, "Words mean what I say they mean." And Alice interrogates him. He makes a fool of himself, and the very idea of an egg precariously placed at the top of a wall, and the idea that all the king's horses and all the king's men, i.e. all the force of the state that it can manifest, can't reassemble it, because politics is predicated on legitimacy and trust. And so the idea that democracy is impotent has it the wrong way around. you're not looking at how totalitarian governments actually function in a constant state of siege against their own people. So they're actually a state of civil war. And so democracy is functioning, it's just carrying out its dialogue with violence at that point.
I think that ending on Alice and Wonderland is a perfect place to draw our conversation to a close, though I think we could all go on for a much longer period of time. I really just want to give my heartfelt thanks to all of you. This was so enriching, and thank you so much, Astra, for inviting this discussion. And I think you will be inviting it for generations to come. I think the beauty of this film in the images, the characters, the ideas we're going to stay with us for a very long time. And we even though we've been resisting nationalisms in this conversation, we are very proud to claim you as a Canadian at this moment because of this film. So and to have it premiere here in our federal capital is a great honor. So a big thank you to all of you. Grand merci à vous tous. Je voudrais aussi remercier notre collègue Marie-Ève Desrosiers qui a travaillé avec nous dès le début sur ce projet. Thank you to the co-host, the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue, and the team behind the initiative, and to all of our partners, especially here at the OAG, Emma Campbell, Marcus, Melissa, Ailey Kite, Jane Guttridge at the NFB, Tom at the CFI, Elena Gaspard of iVote, jeVote, and last but certainly not least, des palmarès dorés de remerciements pour Anna Bogic et René Joubarn du CP from CIPS pour leur travail précieux. We hope to see you all. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. We hope to see you at upcoming events hosted by CIPS, one on the UN Sustainable Development Goals on December 3rd, and another on the Arctic on December 10th. You can find out more on the CIPS Twitter account, a website, and a newsletter. We hope to keep this conversation going. The plan is to continue this conversation in writing. And so you will not hear the end of these wonderful voices and of this discussion. Warmest thanks and for joining us. Merci beaucoup et bonne soirée à toutes et à tous. Au revoir.